What is happening, everyone? Welcome back to another video, and today we're checking out some crystal shells for the PSP as well as the PS Vita. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Now before we go ahead and get started, I do want to mention that I have used these things in the past for several years. I had daily driven them, but later on I decided to stop using them. And I'll talk about that at the end of the video. And the second thing I want to quickly go over here, sometimes they have a bunch of marks on these shells from the inside. And it does look pretty horrendous, but have no fear, as these can actually be wiped down with a microfiber cloth. And if that doesn't work, you can blow on it with a warm breath. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started with the 1000 model. So first things first, this thing will make your chunky PSP even chunkier. So if you got large hands, then you're going to definitely love this. All the controls are perfectly accessible, triggers are unobstructed, D-pad, face buttons are all good to go, and the same thing goes for the analog stick. Which if you're someone who has done the analog stick mod, you should be just fine. But we'll get back to that in just a bit. The power button is accessible, same thing with the Wi-Fi switch, as well as the UMD slot, which is kind of finicky, so you gotta open up this little door right here, which then you can go ahead and open up the UMD. It looks like it's not open all the way, but it is. When you install UMD, you gotta help it out a bit. Sometimes the drive doesn't want to stick, so once you get it in, you should be good to go. And when removing it, it's kind of finicky, so you gotta work with it if you use this long enough, and you can pull it off fairly quick. The mini USB port is accessible, however, it does stop you from using accessories such as a camera. IR sensor is clear. Same goes for the speakers on the bottom, charging port, as well as the headphone jack. Now as you can see here, it doesn't have holes for the front speaker grills. Now it's not that big of a deal, as I think it's an afterthought from Sony, because the speakers are actually pointing downwards. And here's what that looks like on a disassembled PSP, so we can see that it's firing directly downwards. And like I said, it feels like an afterthought, where they were like, you know what, we should get some direct audio facing the user. So they thought, why not just make a hole here to capture some of the leaking audio and fire it directly at the user, even though it's very tiny. So yeah, I did test it. It is noticeable only if you're looking for it. Otherwise, the difference is very minute. But overall, it is a very nice shell. In fact, I would say it's one of the best shells for the PSP lineup. Now you may think we're done with this shell, however we do have two more features which are pretty cool. Starting with the cooler one, and that would be a kickstand. That's right, this thing has a kickstand. And I didn't know about it until I started making this specific video. You see, initially I thought this was actually a second locking mechanism, which it kind of is, and I was absolutely blown away when I found this out. I was like, hold on, and I was just like, it's a stand. Pretty stable, I would say. I mean, it's not falling. Yeah, it might wobble, but if you're watching Family Guy, then this is the perfect way to do it. The second thing I want to talk about here would have to be the front protective lens. So it pops out like so when you want to get an unobstructed view of your screen. In the past, I just kind of removed it. You can just bend it like so and take it out of the hinge. And that's how I personally prefer to use it. Especially nowadays with the glass lenses that we can apply. So unless you want to do some customization in your PSP, you can keep this on, paint it, put some stickers, or just remove it like I do. And the last thing we got to talk about here would have to be shell compatibility. So this is a champagne gold original shell. Front and back, nothing has been changed. And it works perfectly fine. Now let's go in and try something that is 50-50. So we got an original case with a swapped out faceplate. And right off the bat we can notice that it's a slightly tighter fit, but it can work with a little bit of finesse. But once it's all said and done, everything functions as expected. And yes, you can even use it with your 3DS thumbstick mod. Just make sure you don't sand it down too much like I did, as it does get very close to the crystal shell. That being said, even though with my extreme case, with the 3DS stick, it still functions perfectly fine. And of course the same will go with the PS Vita thumbsticks. Just make sure you take off your thumbstick before installing the PSP, as the angle where this thing closes will get in the way, so take it off, install the PSP, and put it back in. So this is a complete aftermarket shell, and the last time I tried this, it's a very tight fit. But that being said, it is definitely doable. Just stick around for the end of the video while I'll talk about the downsides of these shells, and what are some exceptions where you can go ahead and use the shell and not have to worry about anything. So yeah, aftermarket shell, 50-50, and a full original shell will definitely work in this thing. Just gotta do some finessing. And yeah, everything is accessible, except for the camera accessories and whatnot. Otherwise, it does give you a much nicer grip, a kickstand, and overall, if you take care of it, it does improve the looks of your PSP. So, are there any downsides when it comes to this particular model in terms of comfort? So, depending on how you grip your PSP, you may notice that there's a little gap here where the SD card slot is. Honestly, it's not bad, and it's not a sharp angle, so it's pretty smooth. And on the bottom is something I have problems with the other shells. And over here, there are some slight edges right over here. You can sand them down, no problem. The left side, not a whole lot going on. And I would say this does pass my grip test. Nothing too big that I can complain about. If you have any sharp edges, you can just dull them down with some sandpaper and you're good to go. Oh, and finally, here's what it looks like with some LED mods. So I've got two front ones right over here where the controls are. I got two inside the triggers and two poking out from the speaker holes. Overall, it does give your LED modded PSP a whole lot more pizzazz. Next up, let's take a look at the slim models. So we got the 2000 and the 3000 right here. And as you can expect, they're going to work the exact same. So first off, when it comes to the basic function of input and output, pretty much everything is accessible. So you got all the buttons, everything is unobstructed, triggers are happy, analog stick is free, all the various switches are free, and the same goes with the SD card slot, as well as the UMD slot. So this one is much easier to open, unlike the 1000 model. Drop it in, pretty straightforward, lock into place, and you're good to go. Headphone jack and video out is clear, same goes with the charging port. And finally, yes, it does also have a kickstand, and this time it's much more stable as it doesn't wobble as much, which is fantastic. Finally, we do also have a front protective lens, which this time it flips out all the way to the back here, so it's much less obstructive. And like I said before, I just kind of remove it. You can use the same technique, throw on a glass lens, remove it or customize it, it's all up to you. Now as for the complaints, here's what I have. Starting with something very minor, so the triggers here are accessible, however, they are not as free. You are missing out on a couple millimeters right here, so if you like to hit your triggers all the way inside, the shell might get in the way, but with a little adjustment, you should be just fine. My major complaint with these shells would have to be the sharp edges on the bottom here. And what I've done in the past, like I mentioned before, is just go ahead and sand down the areas that I find sharp with some sandpaper, and you're pretty much good to go. And that's honestly my biggest complaint when it comes to comfort. But you can easily deal with it, so it's not that big of a deal if you got some sandpaper or some kind of file. So yeah, overall, if you take care of the sharp edges, it's also a fantastic case. And if you got big hands and you really like how the 1000 model feels, but you got a slim model, well, this thing is going to get pretty close to the 1000 model in terms of chonk. So I think you're going to be pretty happy with it. Again, as long as you sand down all these sharp edges. And we'll show you how to do it at the end of the video, alongside with some customization ideas. So stick around. Oh yeah, and how can I forget? If you've done a stick mod, depending on how you've done it and which stick you picked, it may or may not work. So starting with the most popular one, which is the VITA one, it's going to work perfectly fine since it's got the same footprint as the original one. And it doesn't matter what height you picked. But if you've done anything else that is bigger, such as the Switch, 3DS, as well as the Xbox One stick, especially when you have shaved down the original stick all the way down like I did to get better control, it's going to definitely get in the way. So if you're doing it with a slim model, I would highly recommend you stick with a VITA stick. And finally, here's what it looks like with some LED mods. So we got two in the top, not inside the triggers, two just sitting here on the edge, and two sitting on the bottom corners here. And like with any LED mod, it looks pretty awesome. But the effects are amplified, and they are diffused even more when you have a crystal shell on top. And yeah, if it isn't clear already, you can use it with aftermarket shells, as well as original shells, for both the 2000 and the 3000 models, with the only exception being the 3000 Monster Hunter Edition. And at this point, I should mention that we are reviewing the readily accessible crystal shells. I know there are some from Hori and a bunch of other brands. They're usually expensive because you gotta get them on eBay, so these are the options that everyone can get their hands on relatively easily. And lastly, for the PSP models, we have the PSP Go. And that's because the A1000 never really got enough accessories, so it was kind of left out. So for this one, the installation process is a bit different, but very similar to most PSP Go cases, and here's how it works. So this one comes in two parts, and no, the front lens here is not removable, so if you end up scratching it, well, GG. Otherwise, if you got any fingerprints, dust, or dirt on the screen, or on the inside of the shell, well, you want to clean it up before you put it back in, and vice versa. So that just pops on the front. As for the back, you start from the triggers, and then push it in from the bottom, and that's how you install it. So when it comes to the controls, the front here is perfectly accessible. There's absolutely nothing obstructing it. The home button is still easy to press. As for the media buttons and triggers, they are accessible. However, it does have a lip that goes around here, and you can feel that when you're trying to press these buttons. So although you can still access the triggers, I found them to kind of be annoying because this thing is in the way. Now, of course, you could snip it off with a pair of flush cutters, but you're going to definitely lose out on the integrity of the shell, so to the point where the back cover will just fall off, which defeats the whole point of the shell. Speaking of the shell, it does provide some decent protection while keeping it portable. The back here is no longer rubberized, it's just hard plastic, but all the basic ports are accessible with minimal issues for the most part. In my opinion, it does look good, but if you're very finicky when it comes to the triggers, then this one might not be for you. And finally, we get to the PS Vita lineup. So, what do we got here? Well, there's a whole lot going on, and that's because the PS Vita does have a lot of function, including a rear touchpad. So let's go through it one thing at a time. Starting with the installation process. So it flips up like so. You drop in your Vita right here, you close it back up, lock into the two corners right here, and then you flip this little cover and clip it into place. And once that's done, you're pretty much locked in. So first things first, when it comes to the controls, everything here is accessible, the camera is unobstructed, the analog stick is also perfectly fine. However, when it comes to the PS button, as well as the start and home, they will be even harder to click since Sony decided to go with extra small buttons for some reason. But that's perfectly fine, it's not too big of an issue. The speaker holes on both sides are perfectly lined up. When it comes to the charging port and the headphone jack, they're both accessible. And yes, this does have a kickstand, so that opens up like so. The dreaded memory card slot is still accessible, and the same goes for the game card slot / SD to VITA. Power button, volume controls with minimal obstruction. The triggers are completely free, which is fantastic. And lastly, the rear touchpad is completely exposed for the games that utilize it. And once again, we have this little lip right here, so who knows what it's used for. So overall, when it comes to grip, it does feel pretty good. It makes your PS Vita even chunkier, which you may like. And finally, it does have a kickstand, which is awesome. It's pretty stable, so you can go ahead and grab yourself a DualShock 3 controller and have your little Switch on the go. Overall, a pretty great shell in my opinion, and my biggest complaint would have to be access to these buttons right here. Again, on top of the complaint that I'll have at the end of the video. That being said, when I ordered this shell, I also found this one right here, which is a smoked version, except it turns out it was a completely different style, completely different design, and it does not have the cool kickstand, which is unfortunate. It does look pretty decent, however, it does have a lot of downsides in my opinion, and here they are. But first, let's take a look at the installation process. So this one comes in two parts. You drop your Vita here, followed by the faceplate, and then you clip it all around wherever there are clips. The front controls are perfectly fine. The home, start, and select buttons are still harder to click. However, when it comes to the triggers, they are recessed in there, and it does kind of feel awkward to press, because you can feel the shell on both sides. Just like with the last one, all the ports are accessible. Same thing with the touchpad, and yeah, it does look pretty good with a black on black. However, the biggest downside in my opinion would have to be the home button. It's absolutely abysmal. It's very hard to click because now you have this little thing, and even with my nail here, it's actually very hard to click and very, very annoying. And the same thing goes for the volume controls. That being said, we can go ahead and trim it down without having to worry too much about the shell integrity because we do have some clips on the side here, and that should be enough. So let's see how this goes. And this is going to be a rough cut. I'm not sanding it down or cleaning it up. I'm just doing it as a proof of concept. Shell integrity is still there, and the volume controls are easily accessible now, and the same goes for the home button. So that is one thing you can definitely do. Cut it up, sand it down, and you should be good to go. But at this point, we're still losing out on the cool kickstand, which I think is a pretty big feature, and the fact that the triggers here are recessed into the shell, which you may or may not find it bothersome. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the last one, that being the PS Vita 2000. And this one, I'll tell you straight up, it's pretty fantastic. So the controls are again unobstructed, it's easy to install. Starting with the installation process, pretty straightforward. Drop it in, clip it into place, and you're pretty much good to go. The controls are perfectly accessible. The trigger cutout feels pretty great. The front controls are again unobstructed, camera, speakers, and this time since Sony actually made the buttons bigger, they are much easier to press even with the shell on. Charging port, headphone jack, memory card, as well as the game card, power, and volume controls are easily accessible. These things do get in the way, but at least I can easily click the buttons without too much of a hassle. And finally, the touchpad on the back is easily accessible. Just like with the other ones, it does have a kickstand. However, it's unstable and it's very, very wobbly. So it doesn't have much friction, but I think it's still workable. We can add some rubberized pieces right over here in these edges, and that should stop it from going all the way up and give us a much better angle as well as a sturdier stance. And as a proof of concept, here's some thick double-sided tape. And as you can see, it's a whole lot more sturdier, and you can go ahead and add some more pieces, and you can play around with the thickness to get the feel just right. So yeah, overall, a pretty good case, but with the biggest downside being the kickstand not being very stable, but you can always go ahead and modify it to your needs. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and talk about why I stopped using these shells, as well as why I actually might use them on some of my consoles, which will apply to a lot of you as well. And the reason, my friends, is very simple. These things are going to damage your PSP. Although they protect your PSP from drops and do provide you with a better grip and some cooler features like a kickstand, they will very quickly damage your console. You see, these things don't have any padding on the inside, and you pretty much have hard plastic on hard plastic, or should I say paint, and what you end up with is a very good recipe for disaster. Because not only you have a shell that is actually rubbing against your case, but any dirt particles that get in there will wreak havoc on your PSP every time you move it around, you put it in your pocket. Those little grains will just rub against everything and completely destroy it, which is pretty obvious to be honest, but there are people out there who claim that they have never had an issue, they have it on all their PSP collection, but I'm here to tell you that it will damage your PSP. Not even your PSP, your PS Vita, Nintendo DS, even your phone. In the past, I've had a phone, and I've used hard cases in the past, and they all damaged the trim on my phone, and I'm talking like 2012. So, what does that damage look like? Well, this was one of my first PSPs that I bought after I sold my initial PSP that I modded years ago. So this was actually one of my comeback PSPs, and I got a mint condition one from France, and I was pretty happy with it. It was perfectly clean, it didn't have any scratches, it was pretty great, and it still looks like it, but again, you're watching a video, so you're not going to notice all those small things. However, if you take a look at the bottom, we'll see that the trim here is heavily damaged in certain areas where the shell actually makes contact. And there are a few scuffs here and there on the front, as well as the back, but they're very hard to show on camera. But the biggest one would have to be the Sony logo. I started noticing some of the ink start chipping off. And you're probably telling me, what are you talking about? There's nothing on this thing. Well, if you like to get a mint condition PSP and you want to keep it in the best condition possible, don't get a crystal shell. Get yourself a cheap soft pouch, and that will take care of your PSP a whole lot better than any of these things will. Now, although these damages may look minor, keep in mind these actually took like 2 to 3 weeks before they showed up, and I rarely used my PSP at the time. But just the simple fact of having it inside these shells will damage it over time and very quickly, especially if you put it in your pocket with all the dust particles and all the vibrations. So, hope that's clear. If you got a mint condition console that you absolutely want to keep as is, don't use a hard shell. Which at this point you're probably asking, did I waste my time watching this video? Well, I'm here to tell you no. And the reason is, a lot of people out there don't have mint condition PSPs. They have a hand-me-down, they have a repaired PSP, most likely not in a great condition already. Meaning you can use these things without having to worry about anything, which is fantastic because that takes a weight off your chest, you don't have to worry about it, your PSP or PS Vita is already scratched up, and any marks that may come up, you're probably not going to notice them. Now, how damaged am I talking about? Well, let me find something. I'm talking about something like this. Your console's already scratched up, so what's a few more marks? It's not going to really matter. Unless, of course, it's on your screen, which is something I just remembered why I actually took it off my PSPs in the past, and that would be dust particles getting under this protective cover. Definitely take this thing apart because if you have any dust particles, your PSP is going to be worse off in your pocket with this little protective cover than it is directly in your pocket. Especially if you still have the original plastic lenses, because we already know how prone those things are to scratches. Very soft plastic, and trust me, I've seen someone take their brand new PSP on vacation with these crystal shells, and they ended up with a bunch of scuff marks on their screen, which I ended up swapping it out for a glass lens, and they were pretty much good to go. So yeah, the two case scenarios where I would use these shells, one would have to be with an aftermarket crystal shell. Any fine scratch marks or scuffs, they'll kind of blend in with the transparency of the shell, so not that big of a deal if you're not that nitpicky. And again, if you have already an old PSP that is scratched up or scuffed up, what's a few more scratches? Because in return, you do get a nicer grip, and again, a cool kickstand. And with that being said, we can finally go ahead and show you guys what my old shells look like after prolonged use, and what you could do about it. So starting with the Vita, here's what that looks like in comparison. So we've got the brand new one on the top, and the old used one on the bottom. The new one does have some dust particles under it, so just ignore that. But as you can see, the old one has turned a little grayish because of all the scratches and scuffs. It has very minimal yellowing, even though the environment that I actually stored it in was very hot, so not bad at all. And it's actually been several years in storage, and I just took it out for this video. But overall, not too bad. If you take care of the shell, it should last you a pretty good amount of time with the glossy finish. That being said, who am I kidding? It's going to get scratched up anyways once you put it in your pocket and use it on a regular basis. Which, once we're done with this segment, we're going to go ahead and show you how to turn it into a frosted look PSP, as well as taking care of any sharp edges. And here's one last look at what they look like in comparison. Next up we have the slim shells for the 1000 model, and unfortunately I don't have the same color PSPs, so I'm going to be using the slim models here just for demonstration. And once again, the brand new one on the top, old one on the bottom, and we can see how worn out these things can get. This one got kicked around too much in storage, so it shouldn't be that bad. And finally, the slim models with my actual used one on the bottom right. So this is the one I sanded down on the bottom here for smoother edges. And you can see that if you take care of it, it's not going to be too bad. You know what? Who am I kidding? It's going to get scratched up every time you play it on a table. That being said, one thing you can do is get some grip tape and apply a little piece on the back here. Not only will it give you better grip, but also protect your shell from getting directly scratched on a hard surface. And I'll leave links for that in the description down below, because I don't currently have it on hand. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and bring out the sandpaper. Alright, so I got a tray here with some water, and I'm going to set it off to the side so you guys can see the contrast between what we're doing. And I've got some wet sandpaper. So let's go ahead and give this a try, and we'll start with the highest grit that I have, which is 2500. Basically, we're just going to wet it up like so, and we'll just go over it right here. And the goal here is to actually get a frosted look, and if you have an old one and you want to hide any scratches, then this should take care of it. Alright, and we're just going to quickly check the results here. It just looks like a really scuffed up one. So we're going to go ahead and try out 1200 and see what that looks like. We want the frost to look very obvious and not just like a scuffed up piece of plastic, so we got to get the right amount of sanding. I think that's going to look alright. Of course, if we do the inside, it will magnify the effect even more, and it should look way more consistent. So let's give that a try and see what it looks like. Probably recommend you do these parts separately so they're not flopping around and they don't break while you're going through them. And for this one, I'm going to have a small piece so I can easily get around it. Now the tough part is going to be all the little corners that you have to cover. And let's quickly dry it and get a feel of what it's going to look like. You know, with a bit of work, I think it's going to look pretty alright. Doesn't look all that great because of the inconsistencies, but overall, I think if we cover the whole shell, it might look pretty cool. So let's keep going. And I'm going to do this off camera because it's going to take forever. So we'll be back in just a bit. All right, and here's the result after 15 minutes of rough work. So we've used 1200 grit wet sandpaper and just roughly went through it. I cut up small pieces and went through it with my thumb, with my finger, inside and out, washed it under the sink, dried it with a microfiber cloth, and this is what it looks like. Again, this is a quick rough sample. It's not for everyone, but if you're trying to hide your scratches, I think this is one way to go about it. I think it looks pretty decent, not too bad, and we can give it a try with a few different colors. So let's see what that looks like. Here's the champagne gold. I think this one blends in pretty well. Here's the clear matte blue. And I think this one definitely ruins the whole look. Here we have a lavender purple 2000. I think it looks all right-ish. Here's my clear PSP 2000. And not so much. Here's a navy blue 2000. And I think this one looks all right. It kind of fits the whole frosted theme. As for my radiant red, I actually don't mind this. It looks pretty good. You can get two of these. You can make one frosted and one glossy and then figure out what you like. Of course, you can always go ahead and paint it if you're an artist, or slap some stickers on it from AliExpress. It's really up to you. And by the way, this is not a brand new one that I used. This was one of my old ones. I think it looks a whole lot better than what it looked like before, where it was all scuffed up and you can clearly see the glossy parts and these scratched parts. Now everything is scratched up from inside out, so now it gives it somewhat of a uniform look. And again, if you have any rough edges, just sand it over with some sandpaper or get one of these file sets. Links for everything will be in the description down below. So yeah, with all that being said, that is all for this video. My current stance on these things is that if you got a mint condition PSP or PS Vita, please avoid using these things and instead get yourself a simple pouch. But if that's not the case and you got a scuffed up console, then I would say go ahead, get yourself one and enjoy it, because it does give you a better grip, especially with the PSPs. They do slightly hide your scratches, and if you want, you can always go ahead and frost it up. But either way, one thing for sure is that you definitely want to remove these windows, because these are a trap for dirt, and once dirt and debris gets trapped in there, you're pretty much screwed, because you're going to end up with a bunch of scuff marks on your screen, and that's no fun. And yes, even if you have a glass lens, it will eventually scratch it. So please, just remove these things. So yeah, with all that being said, that is all for this video. So if you have any questions, do let me know in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care, everyone.